So I'm going to introduce Professor Sally Sheard, who is the, and I can't remember if I get the first name right, was it Andrew Geddes and John Rankin Professor of Modern History at the University of Liverpool, who I've heard before, who's an absolutely superb speaker, and I'm always humbled by the proper historians who I've listened to in recent years who really bring to life so many fascinating things. So he's going to talk on From the Street to the Clinic via the Club, Our Medical Communities Emerge and Survive. So thank you very much,
Simon. Thank you very much to the college for the invitation. It's wonderful to be involved with this huge anniversary. Not many organisations get to 500 years, so it is something that definitely needs lots of celebrating. And it's fantastic, I think it's happening in this year when we've also got the 70th anniversary of the NHS, and I'm involved at the moment with some very interesting plans to help celebrate that in July. So, my title is slightly deliberately vague. The street, that could mean just about anything, but it is probably in Liverpool, it means one particular street, and yes, there will be Rodney Street within my talk. Clinic, euphemism for the GP clinic, the hospital clinic, where medicine is practiced, and the club, again, well, how am I going to take that one on? I know I've had several emails the last few days saying, you will be talking about this, won't you? And you won't be talking about that, will you? So I hope I don't upset people, but I hope I interest you. I know that here we've got a mix in the audience. I see lots of familiar medical faces, but I also see, and I know that there are lots of members of the public here. So I've deliberately made this a broad talk. There's not too much technical stuff in it, I hope. It's probably not enough technical stuff for the doctors, so you can shout at me later. So, 1518, Royal College of Physicians. A lot of this has already been said for me, very kindly, in the film. I didn't know we were going to have that, but it's very helpful. When the college was founded, Liverpool was little more than a fishing village on the banks of the Mersey. But London was a thriving city, and it needed to have some way to regulate the quality and the quantity of the medical services that was available for the population. There are some fantastic quotes that I haven't got time to go into here in that first charter about protecting the king's liege subjects from the hurt that could be done to them by the unlicensed practitioners. So the physicians emerge as just one part of a medical community, and it's a very disjointed medical community up until that great consolidating Act of Parliament that comes in 1858, the Medical Registration Act. But before that Act, we have 3 centuries of competition and discord, particularly with surgeons, not looking at anybody in particular here, who form a company. 1540, they're a little bit later off the mark than the physicians. They're a company, crucial word. They're not a college, they are a company. They have an apprenticeship scheme rather than a university education. They get a Royal College in 1800s. They've got a little bit further to go for their 500th anniversary. Alongside our physicians and our surgeons, there is a third leg to this group that we know as the regular medical practitioners, the ones who are proper, are licensed, have some form of recognised qualification. And they're the apothecaries, and they form a society, a worshipful society, in 1617. And medical practitioners before 1858 would have a variety of qualifications and letters after their name. Quite often they'd have licences. They might be college and hall. They might be a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and also have an apothecary's qualification on the side. So what changes in 1858? The medical register tries to make it easier for the public to understand who they can trust to be a doctor. They create the medical register. If you want to see them, we have them here in the medical institution library. Very nice fat red tomes in which they list everybody who has a proper qualification. Lists where they got the qualification and where they practice and where they live. Fantastic information for historians. But we see in the 19th century the emergence of the general practitioner, the GP, the doctor who can look after you in that great Beveridge expression, cradle to grave. They can do a bit of the physic, a bit of the surgery, a bit of the apothecary. And the medical marketplace becomes a tighter and more competitive environment. Alongside this very quick changing medical environment, there have been places where the public know they can go to obtain medical services. And we've got two streets here. We've got Rodney Street in Liverpool, literally 500 yards down the road from where we are now. And we've got Harley Street in London. And the two are seen as the sort of the iconic doctors' streets in Britain. There are others around the world. Apparently Sydney has one too. Is it Macquarie Street, I think? The unique thing about these streets is that doctors chose to congregate, to take rooms, to buy houses in which they could make their profession. They'd have consulting rooms on the ground floor and they'd live on the first, second, third floors. Rodney Street emerges in the early 19th century. I didn't bring my clicker. I don't think I brought. Just let me see if I brought my clicker. Hopefully it's going to work. Wonderful. Okay. So, Liverpool in 1829. Very different environment, size of place to the one we have now. I could ask Paul Laxton to come up and talk at length about Liverpool in 1829. Paul's sitting here in the middle. I'm going to just very briefly indicate for you some key features, if I can do it without falling over. In particular, the big institutions, the lunatic asylum, the infirmary, and of course Rodney Street coming along here. This is where the Anglican Cathedral was later built, and the Catholic Cathedral was somewhere over there. So you might think, well, why are the doctors congregating in Rodney Street? Why are they not down here? Why are they not down around the Customs House, around the commercial centre, around Dale Street, Tythebarn Street? Surely that's where the business is. That's where the people with the money are. Why are they up on Rodney Street? Partly because they do want to live in a pleasant environment. And in the early 19th century, Rodney Street was a beautiful environment to live in. It was on the perimeters of the urban area. There was fresh air. And when you think about theories of disease at the time, particularly the miasmatic theory, being up on the hill above the smells of the lower town and the docks was a sensible choice. So Rodney Street emerges as our medical street in Liverpool. It's a fine Georgian set of houses. The picture on the right-hand side is a painting from the mid-20th century, but it shows a very typical arrangement, a very educated environment, a book-lined room, chairs for the physicians to sit in, chairs for the patients to sit in, appropriate furniture, appropriate furnishings. So it was laid out in 1783 by William Roscoe. It's named after Lord Rodney, who was the naval hero of a battle. And by 1825, the street's virtually completed. It has, from the start, a number of significant medical residents and medical families, and this is an important theme. I know Sue Evans lived on Rodney Street with her father for many years. There was a tradition of handing down practices and handing down properties. The Brandreth family moved in. Richard Formby held rooms at number 10 and number 12. George Freckleton was there in the 1820s, and I could go on, I could list a lot of names, but I haven't got time to do that. But the status of the street changes very quickly. Within at least the first 30 years, by the 1820s, we have the wealthier people, the merchants, moving out. And Picton, one of the great Liverpool journalists, writes in 1875, he says, after a reign of quiet dignity, the physicians and surgeons began to colonise. The dentist follows. Then a modest display of wares in the parlour window indicates the modiste, or the brilliant red and blue jars give token of the druggist, the apothecary, definitely a social run down from the physicians. By and by, a shop window is boldly put forth, radiant with plate glass and gold. The triumph of the trader is inevitable. Very sniffy comment from Picton, really reflecting the realities of urban change in a 19th century city. So as people got the money, they would move out. They moved out to Wavertree, to Woolton, to Blundell Sands. They moved across the river into Birkenhead, further out to West Kirby, Heswall, places like that. So what happens with Rodney Street is that the doctors would retain consulting rooms, but they'd move their family and they would travel in on a daily basis. And some of the larger properties were suitable for lodging houses or for schools. And there's a lot of this repurposing of buildings that goes on in cities like Liverpool. Some of you will have seen A House Through Time, which was aired earlier this year. That was an absolutely brilliant programme, and it really captured the sort of transience of an urban community by following one particular Liverpool house on Faulkner Street, very much like the Rodney Street properties. So why is Rodney Street important? Why is its particular location important? Not only does it provide salubrious housing and then consulting rooms for our physicians and surgeons, it's also very conveniently located. So it's convenient for the infirmaries. These are the voluntary, the charitable hospitals in which the physicians would give their time for free, because they knew then that they could pick up those patients in their private consulting rooms at other opportunities. Liverpool's second infirmary opens in 1824 up on Brownlow Hill. It's the most beautiful looking building, isn't it, with those fantastic Greek pillars at the front. And the patrons are parading here in their Sunday finery, and you've got the odd patient being carried in on a stretcher as well. It doesn't particularly look like your average hospital. It's designed for the benefits of the patron rather than the benefits of the patient. Rodney Street was convenient for other hospitals too. So we had the infirmary on Pembroke Place, but we also had the Consumption Hospital, which was built on the corner of Rodney Street and Mount Pleasant in 1904. We had other hospitals in the vicinity. We had the Women's Hospital on Shaw Street, opened in 1882. We had the Third Royal Infirmary, but before that, we had another important development for Liverpool medicine, and that's the creation of the Liverpool Medical School, which found a new home in 1844, up adjacent to the infirmary on Dover Street. And there's just one bit of this building that remains, and that's this section here, which is, if you look very carefully on the university campus, you can find it. These were the necessary requirements for medicine to thrive and to progress in a city like Liverpool. Not only did you need a community of practitioners, but you needed somewhere in which you could grow your next generation of practitioners. You needed a medical school. And over the course of the 19th century, the various small medical schools, anatomy schools, such as the ones operated on Seal Street, got into a lot of trouble because they had bodies in beer barrels illegally. That's a Dr. William Gill, I believe. They slowly decided that yes, they would come together and they would form one medical school. The next huge development that really shifts the centre of gravity for the medical community is the formation of the third Liverpool Royal Infirmary. Again, a voluntary, a charitable hospital, a high status hospital, funded by patrons with a few big donors from the wealthy merchant families, and just a little bit further up the hill on Brownlow Hill from the second infirmary. Designed partly by Florence Nightingale. She's responsible for the long pavilion Nightingale wards. Very important to her that they had lots of big windows because Nightingale was a confirmed miasmatist. She believed that disease was smell. Smell was disease. You had to have the windows open, the air blowing through. She did not like the 2 blocks of round pavilion circular wards that had to be squeezed into the site to get the appropriate number of beds. So not only do you need places for doctors to live, hospitals in which you can treat your patients, consulting rooms, medical communities need an intellectual heart and they need a social heart as well. And that is facilitated in Liverpool by a number of different developments. The first thing is the creation of a medical library in 1779, one of the oldest medical libraries in the world. And that collection of books was initially housed further down in the city centre in the dispensary. It had a number of homes. Finally, in the early 19th century, the doctors of the city said, why don't we actually build a purpose-built room in which, or set of rooms in which we can meet, and we're in it now. So this was built in 1837. And if you haven't been in this building before, I would encourage you to just take a few moments and go and explore its treasures, particularly walk along through the corridor and into the library. It is the most wonderful library. And in fact, I've got a visiting student over here at the moment with me from the University of California, San Francisco, who has come because we have brilliant collections of papers. Christina is sitting back, sorry Christina to point you out, is interested in the work of Charles Sherrington and the foundations of neurology in Liverpool. So we've got a lot that we can offer within our medical institution even now. The Liverpool Medical Institution is founded and it grows very quickly as the number of doctors grow in the city. So this is what the LMI membership looks like in 1892. This picture's not taken in this building. I actually don't know where this picture is taken. I'd be interested if anybody does know. By this time, we have a community of around 700 doctors working in Liverpool, and around 400 of them are members of the LMI. That gives you some sense of the importance of this institution to the medical profession in the city. And it's important for all sorts of reasons. So doctors would come here, as my title suggests, literally from the street. They would walk up from Rodney Street, they'd come here for lunch, and then they might go on to a clinic in a hospital. It could be the Royal Infirmary, It could be one of the municipal hospitals that were functioning in Liverpool by the early 20th century. It might be the tuberculosis sanatorium at Fazakerley. It might be the old workhouse hospital at Walton or Mill Road. Liverpool had, apparently, nearly 90 hospitals at the turn of the 20th century, which is just an amazing number. And that obviously includes houses on Rodney Street that might have had a couple of beds but would then qualify to be called a hospital. So it's a vibrant medical community by the early 20th century. And that vibrancy allows a number of things to happen that are important not just for Liverpool medicine, but for national and international medicine. And I've chosen just two from that era. I could talk about a lot, but I think these are the two really fascinating ones. First one is Ronald Ross, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1902 for his work on understanding how malaria is transmitted and the particular role of the Anopheles mosquito. And he did that research from Liverpool, from his position as a lecturer here, and he went off on his travels internationally, but he came back, and he's seen here sitting outside my building where my office is, in the Whelan and Johnson buildings, which was the medical school by this time. And sitting next to him, perched on the arm of this chair, another interesting chap, Rupert Boyce, who was the first professor of pathology. He did some really quite bizarre research. I'd be fascinated to get a student to look into on the influence of absinthe on cats. Not something I think you get ethical approval for today. So Ross would have come here. He'd have come to meetings here. He would have discussed those tentative ideas on the theories of malaria transmission with his colleagues, with his friends here in this lecture theatre. Another chap who would have been coming here, probably on a weekly basis, is Charles Sherrington. Another of our Nobel Prize winners, 1932. But he was working here between 1895 and 1913 when he was the Holt Professor of Physiology. And his classic piece of research was published as The Integrative Action of the Nervous System in 1906. And Sherrington did what Liverpool doctors have done so well for so many years. He built himself a team, and he brought together people like Warrington. He built his labs, and he constructed the absolutely perfect environment for world-class research. But as soon as Oxford called in 1913 with the offer of the Waynflete Chair of Physiology, he was hot-footing it down to Oxford as quickly as he could. And I mean, who could blame him? Did he look back on his days in Liverpool with fondness? An interesting question, but maybe one indication of what he thought comes in a letter that he wrote to Howard Florey. Florey of the Florey and Chain work on penicillin, one of Sherrington's junior protégés at Oxford. Florey saw a job advertised at Liverpool, and he wrote to Sherrington. He said, "I'm thinking of applying for this job at Liverpool. What do you think my chances are?" And Sherrington replied, he said, "I wouldn't bother." He said, "There's nowhere decent to live." So, Sherrington maybe didn't experience the joys of Liverpool life, but there were lots of doctors who did. Medicine practice is changing too, rapidly. Through the 19th century into the 20th century, the concept of the firm becomes the most important modus operandi for medical practice in hospitals. The picture here is of John Hay, who was a another of Liverpool's pioneering physicians, cardiologist, who went on to found the Cardiac Club as well. This is taken in the 1930s, and they are at the back of the 3rd Royal Infirmary. And the firm is central to medicine. It is still central to medicine, but in a slightly different way. But the philosophy behind it is that you had a strong leader who could grow his team, and that the team functioned well because everybody knew what everybody else was doing, and you were in very regular contact because you spent a lot of time in the hospital and the junior doctors would live in. By the time Hay is working at the infirmary and seeing his patients on Rodney Street, medicine is not in a happy place. We are producing increasing numbers of doctors, and I've put in here just some average years for medical school graduates. So in 1865, we were producing about 28 doctors a year. This had gone up by 1950 to 80. We had a peak, I think, I'm trying to think what the peak intake was. I'm sure somebody will correct me. I seem to remember in one year, in the mid-2000s, we took in nearly 300 medical students a year. In the 1930s, the problem was that there wasn't the business for doctors. This was a time of international worldwide recession, rising unemployment, problems of poverty. People had to pay for their medical service up front, out of pocket. Many doctors struggled to make a living. A great example of this is A.J. Cronin's novel, The Citadel. If you've not read it, I highly recommend it. It shows you the struggles that the average doctor had to scrape a living. The ethical issues they had about sending debt collectors out on a Friday evening to go and pick up the payments from their patients who they know couldn't afford their payments. And it's summarised quite neatly here in this dinner menu card. What a thing to put on a graduation dinner menu card. 1926, Liverpool Medical School. So these poor chaps, few lasses, had arrived fresh-faced at medical school in slide 1. They'd gone away, they'd done their physiology, they'd done their anatomy, they'd done their microbiology, surgery, obstetrics. They graduated, and then the final slide down here is they're effectively on the dole. They're signing on at the Labour Exchange. So what did Liverpool's medical community do to try to support their doctors? Not a great deal. It was every man for himself. The hospitals that were struggling, particularly the voluntary hospitals, did try to unite, to club together. So in 1936 we get the first amalgamation happening of hospitals in Liverpool. We've been trying ever since various permutations of amalgamations. 1936, 4 hospitals technically merged, although the sites remained separate, but they're governed by one governing body. Now I can see a few wry smiles around the room because this is something that we are struggling with at the moment. They were not comfortable bedfellows. They did not like having that single board of governors. It did not work well for Liverpool in the late 1930s. But of course, all of that changes with the arrival, firstly, the arrival of the Second World War. And in 1939, the government set up the Emergency Medical Service. And in Liverpool, it's run from here. Keith Monsrat is the officer, and he has a room up where the ladies' loos are now, on the first floor. And from that room, he directed the Emergency Medical Service for Liverpool and the immediate environment. Hospitals were forced to collaborate. Hospitals were temporarily nationalised. It meant that doctors from the Royal Liverpool sometimes found they had to take patients from Walton or Broad Green. it forced doctors to think about how you work better together and collaborate. And one way in which doctors found they really did have to collaborate came after the end of the war, when we have a change of government and the new Labour government, with Aneurin Bevan as the Minister of Health, boldly announces that they will implement Beveridge's welfare state plan. And by 1948, there was a standoff between the medical profession and the government, nicely summarised here in this Vicky cartoon, in which we have Bevan walking down Harley Street with all of the doctors peering out anxiously from their windows, and it just says it all at the bottom, doesn't it? Here he comes, boys. They've got the tripwire set up for him. They've got the anaesthetists on one side, they've got the surgeons on the other. They're determined that Bevan is not going to take away their professional independence. What Bevan wanted to do was to reorganise the medical profession and to offer them an opportunity to work as salaried doctors within the National Health Service. This idea that, as Jane Dacre was saying in the film, everybody would have free medical care at the point of delivery, funded by general taxation. A radical change in how medicine was going to be delivered. And it came about, the doctors, after 3 plebiscites held by the British Medical Association, finally agreed that yes, they would work within the new NHS under some conditions. The provinces played a big role in this. It was a democratic process. They had votes, they had rights, but more importantly, there were significant individuals who took a leadership role. One of these is here, up here, Henry Cohen, always with a clean white handkerchief in his breast pocket. He was instrumental in the creation and the early years of the National Health Service. And as recognition for that, he was the first provincial physician to be given a peerage in 1956. And Cohen held a number of roles, national roles, over the course of his career. He was chair of the Standing Medical Advisory Committee, he was president of the BMA, he was president of the Royal Society of Medicine, and he was president of the General Medical Council. That's the body that runs the medical register. Cohen was a local lad. He was born in Birkenhead in 1900. He went to Liverpool Medical School. He was one of the brightest, most respected clinicians of his generation. He became Professor of Medicine at the absurdly young age of 34. Well, it was absurd at the time, probably not so much now. And he built up a prestigious practice, which included apparently members of the royal family. But he never left his Liverpool home. He never gave up his Rodney Street attachment, choosing instead to buy a Rolls-Royce for his regular commutes down to see his wealthier patients in London. Cohen was part of what, by the mid-20th century, we could call perhaps the medical mafias. And I'm very grateful to Felix Goodbody, who's sitting up there at the back. Felix is one of my PhD students, and he is looking at the emergence of medical networks in Liverpool, and particularly interested in the role of the medical institution. And I know Felix is very keen to talk to people if you've got any oral history that you would like to share with him. He's been doing interviews. Thank you very much, Felix, for this access to your database, which I've taken this map from. What I've done here is to show you where LMI members lived in the 1960s. And I hope what you can see So this is LMI members. This isn't all doctors. Not all doctors have been members of the LMI, but it gives you an indication of where those centres of the medical profession were. So we've got quite a cluster down here around Walton, a few down right on the banks in Cressington Park, I imagine that is, and Fulwood Park. We've got a significant medical mafia up here in Blundell Sands and Crosby. Have we got any in this evening? No? Okay. Oh, thank you very much. We've also got significant groups of doctors over here in West Kirby and down here in Heswall, and a few around the outskirts of Birkenhead. What we don't have in the 1960s, apart from perhaps Sue Evans' family, are doctors choosing to live in their consulting room properties in Rodney Street. I think in the 1960s, according to the LMI lists, there are only 4 doctors living in Rodney Street, which is, I think, quite a surprising change. So why is this shift happening? Why are doctors choosing to live in certain places and not other places? Part of it is the very nature of the NHS, that doctors no longer have to actively compete for patients. The referrals now happen smoothly, supposedly, between primary care and secondary care, between the GPs and the hospitals. There's no longer that competitive putting up of plates, announcing your arrival in Rodney Street, touting for business. And things continue to change. We go through into the 1960s with Enoch Powell's ambitious hospital building plan. Liverpool is granted permission to build a mega hospital. They decide that they will now finally close the Stanley up here, the Royal Southern, the David Lewis Northern, and the old Liverpool Royal Infirmary, which has served us very well for nearly 100 years, and to build a new hospital, which opens finally in 1978. Cohen didn't live to see the Royal open. I understand he would not have been happy with the new Royal. It defeated his ideas of what doctors should be, that generalism should be protected, specialism should be treated with caution, specialist units, academic units in particular, should be treated with caution. So I've talked now for, 20 minutes maybe, 25 minutes. How many women have I mentioned? Not one. Nightingale. Okay, Nightingale. Thank you, Chris. I'll give you Nightingale. So where are the women in medicine? They are there, but they're not very obvious. So we have our iconic first pioneering female doctors, Elizabeth Blackwell, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Sophia Jex-Blake. We have the Women's Medical Federation set up. It's their centenary this year. But it's increasingly obvious that there is a demand and a need for women to be professional in medicine, not just deliver the lay care at home very competently. Liverpool has the first female medical student who qualifies in 1911, Phoebe Powell. And then it's the end of the wedge. By 1955, there is a legal requirement that all medical schools take women. By 1977, the Sex Discrimination Act is necessary to force those final medical schools to abolish quotas. There were some medical schools, London, that decided that they would have women, but not too many of them. The quotas were absolutely fine. There have always been medical societies and medical clubs. So how do you define the difference between a society and a club? I suggest one way is that societies have perhaps unlimited membership, that you could apply to join a society, and if you met the requirements, then maybe you would be admitted. We have a number of very eminent societies founded, particularly in London, from 1773 onwards. And one of the most notable, of course, is the Royal Society of Medicine, which was an amalgamation of 17 separate societies in 1907. Clubs are slightly different. Here are two quotes for you. Samuel Johnson: "Club is an assembly of good fellows meeting under certain conditions." Groucho Marx is slightly more upfront. "I don't want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as a member." There's this sense of clubbable, that clubs are by invitation. And certainly many clubs, medical clubs, have been limited in the numbers that they would choose to admit. That the Sydenham Club was restricted initially to 18, 6 surgeons, 6 physicians, 6 apothecaries. The Moynihan Chirurgical Club, again, very restricted membership. The Medical Pilgrims, and I can see at least one pilgrim just leaving the room now.
Only to tell Simon that he ought to go now.
You've got to get your train, Simon.
I wouldn't dream of leaving.
The Medical Pilgrims, set up 1928, initially restricted to 21 medical practitioners, physicians. The Travelling Surgical Society has a similar arrangement, a restricted number. The 1942 Club, yes, set up in 1942, has the same. It's restricted, this time to deans of medical schools and people of suitable eminence. They are social clubs, but they have an intellectual validity and raison d'etre. So the pilgrims have always made their pilgrimages once a year to places of scientific and medical interest, such as Paris. They go to observe the latest advances in medicine. It's a fantastic route by which they know what's coming up. They know which practitioners are building their careers. I've got a whole number of pictures. I've chosen just this one from Paris to put in. The accounts that the pilgrims write are equally fascinating, and this material is publicly available, and it's in the Wellcome Library in London if you'd like to go and read any of the scribes' reports. They're very entertaining as well. Pilgrimages over the course of 2 or 3 days would involve travel, the ardours of travel, fine wine, fine dining, convivial company. You had to get on with your fellow pilgrims, and they would only select people that they knew were going to be suitable to go on these trips. Another of our pilgrims was Cyril Clarke. He was certainly clubbable. He was elected as a pilgrim in 1971, and he did his first pilgrimage to Birmingham, of all places, which was hosted that year. The leader was Melville Arnott, and he wrote him a thank you letter the following day. Typical handwriting here, but I'll decipher a little bit for you. He said, "What a pilgrimage I did enjoy myself." He goes on to say, "Thank you so much. I drank far too much, but luckily I got up the next morning without a trace of a hangover by 4:15 a.m. He then got back to Liverpool and was annoying his HP, his house physician, by 7:30 a.m. So there is a culture around this that is very much, you want your friends in these clubs, and it is a sign that you have arrived. What can clubs do for you? Why do people want to go on pilgrimages and join these clubs? Well, for people like Clarke in 1971, they were useful. One example, the following year, Melville Arnott is now writing to John Ellis. He's saying, "It's a great pleasure to make the Hajj with you. You will remember you mentioned to me that you were looking for a good gastroenterologist. Clifford and I are quite sure we have one." And he goes on, he's a most capable gastroenterologist, particularly lower gut. doing first-class work with the fibroscope. Frankly, I think he is too good for a regional hospital. If that is not a terribly non-egalitarian thing to say. At any rate, when your post is advertised, I would ask you to look closely at his application. That's one example of these clubs. The clubs are not just national, there are local ones too. They're an important part of medicine. In Liverpool, we had the Liverpool Medical and Literary Society, founded in 1884. Fascinating organisation. It had a requirement that members attended 3 times a week. And at those meetings, there would be poetry reading and boxing. Boxing regimes would happen that the toughest boxer would take on people in turn, and as one was knocked out, the next one would stand up, so everybody would get a go with the boxing gloves. 1900, the Innominate Club was founded. In 1908, the 20 Club was founded. The purpose of these was, at the time that they were founded, to provide light relief from the strains of medical work, an opportunity to exercise interests in literature and art, poetry. There have been other clubs over the years. There was a Jewish medical society in Liverpool for many years. Some of these, I'm not going to tell you which ones in detail, also, as with the medical pilgrims, have involved the indulgence in fine wines and fine food. Where are the women in these clubs? Well, they appear quite late. So the 1942 club very reluctantly admitted Sheila Sherlock in 1959, and only because she'd become Dean of Hammersmith, and there was no way that they could keep her out. The medical pilgrims admitted their first female pilgrim in 1996, Dame Parveen Kumar. You can see her here. This is on a pilgrimage to Dublin in 1999. And you might say, well, what's the benefit for women in joining these clubs? And particularly the way clubs work, where you might only elect one woman or one member a year, you might have a very, very slow transition from an all-male to a slightly more balanced membership. So the benefits aren't immediately obvious. And it's difficult. So this is Neil Kessel writing in 1983 on a forthcoming 1942 club meeting. He says, I would be very happy to share a room with any other club member who was going to be unaccompanied, so long as they would have me, and they weren't Sheila Sherlock. I've nothing against dames, capital D, it's just antipathy against dames. They spend too long in the bathroom. So it's fun. And I'm sure that Neil Kessel wrote it in jest, but underneath that, there is that antipathy about where women fit in medicine, and is it okay to have them practicing, but how far do you want them to intrude on traditional medical activities and societies? The women have been there too, as Jane Dacre said in her film. Margaret Turner Warwick was the first female head of the Royal College of Physicians, elected in 1989. For surgeons, it was the Irish College that first had a female president, Eilis McGovern, elected in 2012, 6 years ago. And women in Liverpool medical societies, we had our first member at the LMI in 1888. Lucy Craddock was aged 23. It took her 4 years of petitioning for the LMI to agree that she could join. And she could join to use the library, but she had to ask special permission to attend meetings because the membership might not approve of having a woman in the room. There were petitions for her not to attend meetings, so you can imagine how she would have felt turning up, the only female sitting in here, surrounded by 100+ men who did not, and made it very clear they did not want her to be there. First female president of the LMI, 1957. I'm not sure how many we've had since then. Maybe Sue could tell us later. Women in Liverpool medical clubs. Robert Sells, 1997, 30 years ago, in his presidential address said, "A sad feature of the 20 Club and its cousin, the Innominate Club, is that women are not allowed at regular meetings. I'm quite sure that rule will change someday."
Not yet.
So, there is a paradox, I think, in medical culture and medical practice. That we have a profession that has to adopt and adapt and change with the times. The very nature of clinical practice requires doctors to be up to date. Doctors, by their nature, are gregarious, social. They're resourceful, they're cultured, and we can see that if we look at the significant number of doctors who are skilled musicians, artists, poets, bibliophiles. They practice what Sherrington advised, work hard and play hard. Good medical practitioners are invariably team players. The paradox is, why are they not inclusive team players on all occasions and in all environments? So, what I hope I've shown for you over the last 40 minutes is how much Liverpool medicine has changed, what the pressures have been, from the arrival of visionary people like Sherrington, Cohen, through to the complete radical restructuring of how medicine is done through the NHS in 1948, that makes Rodney Street marginal perhaps, when now everybody has free access unless they choose to go and pay for it and see a doctor privately in a private consulting room. And Liverpool's medicine is still changing, and medicine in Britain is changing, and the challenges facing the NHS today, particularly accommodating people who wish to work part-time or for shorter careers, means that I think it has to become a more modern and more inclusive culture and environment. Thank you very much.
So, Sally, thanks very much for that. That was fascinating. I came to Liverpool in 1986 and I really had no idea of the historical city, medically wise, I was coming into. That was an amazing talk, and I've learned a lot. And I'd like to present you with a medal from the Liverpool Medical Institution engraved for this evening, and thank the Royal College of Physicians for supporting tonight. Thanks very much.
How lovely. Thank you very much, Colin. It's wonderful.
Are you prepared to take some discussion
I would take discussion and questions, as long as nobody shoots me. Ian.
I mean, the Honourable Secretary of the Innominate Club will tell you more eloquently than I about when women were admitted to the Innominate Club. But I'm just wondering where you see doctors and medical society, etc., versus law, business, other factions of society in their willingness or otherwise to bring in women?
That's a very good question. I have begun to look at this because it's actually part of my academic research interests at the moment. And I have to say medicine does appear to be slightly behind the curve compared to the legal profession. And I'm not sure why, whether it's the sort of intrinsic nature of what doctors do, or if it's something to do with the age of the profession and its relationship with the government, perhaps. I can't answer that. All I can say is that from the research I've done so far, it does appear that there is this paradox that doctors have to cope with change, but they are probably more reluctant to let go of some of those older traditions that they've sort of cultivated over the last 300-400 years.
Please, Chris. Yeah.
That was an absolutely fascinating lecture. I'm getting really interested in medical history. I was quite surprised you didn't notice something that's rather dear to my heart, and that's the Birkenhead Medical Society, which was founded in 1856. But one of the interesting things in what you were saying about societies, allowing anybody in clubs being more specific, reminded me of the fact that Dr. Alice Kerr, who was one of the first women to practice in Birkenhead, although I noticed she got her MD in Bern, she also was educated at the London Medical College for Women, I think it was called. Anyway, she applied to join Birkenhead Medical Society in the latter part of the 20th century, and they turned her down. But interestingly, as you said about the lady who joined the LMI, she was allowed to use their library, but they wouldn't let her join the proper meetings. And I must say that looking through the Society's precedents, it was, I think, after the Second World War, before they had their first lady, Dr. Esme Grant, as their president. And even then, there's only been 5 ladies since who have been president of this society. It's been going, as I say, since 1856, so there's an awful lot of men there.
Yeah. I could also mention the Southport Medical Society. There are a lot of these societies. Some of them are no longer active, but obviously, some are. Yeah.
Can I just be a bit mischievous here, Sally? I spoke at an all-women medical society, the WIST, Women in Surgical Training, and I was talking about relationships. And I was exploring how the dishwasher can become a bone of contention. People need to arrange the plates in a certain way, and the other person rearranges them. And there was one female surgeon in the front row glaring at me, and I said, "Have you an issue with this?" "Yes," she said, "I have a husband. I don't do dishwashing." And obviously I'm a member of the 20 Club, and I was president. And we did experiment with women one year, and we had several women at the 20 Club. And
you might want to rephrase that, Colin.
I'm not sure they thoroughly enjoyed it, and the atmosphere was odd, and it just fizzled out.
I wonder why.
And we also used to run a ladies' night, and after about 20 years of this, our wives, it was like pulling teeth to come to these ladies' nights. Eventually it just fizzled out, so we don't actually have a ladies' night anymore. So I actually don't know where this is going. Can I just say I sit on the fence?
You don't sound it.
I think I can tell you why women were so late in entering the medical profession. When I was a medical student in 1941 or 42, I asked our dean, Professor Gibson, why there were no female medical students. And he said with a lisp, "That's because we haven't got any lavatory accommodation for them."
Oh, the other explanation, John, was that there wasn't a separate dissection room.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And some medical societies, one London one, excluded women because their bylaws only referred to people with male gender. Therefore, they couldn't possibly change the bylaws.
But at this joint meeting, do you know when ladies were first allowed to take the membership examination at the London College of Physicians?
No, I don't.
Do you?
It's about 100 years ago, but no more recently.
I think that the surgeons were 1907.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
round about then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please, yeah.
I just don't feel I can not mention Frances Ivans, who was the first woman appointed surgeon at Stanley Hospital in 1907.
Thank you, Meg. Yes, good to have that on record. Thank you.
Yes, we had a Frances.
And remember here, in the same year, there was 5 or 6 other women in that year,
Yeah.
and she became vice president in 1924.
Yes.
Yes, we used to have a Frances Ivans lecture. I don't know
We
why.
still
that
do.
is, we still do.
We do, yes.
Mm.
Derek.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a non-sexist question. The second Royal Infirmary was a beautiful building.
Mm.
Do you know what happened to it?
I don't. I imagine it was demolished.
To build the third. It was on the corner of the site where the third was built.
Okay,
On
right.
Brandon Street.
Yeah. Yeah, that does sound right. I know it was almost on the same plot. Yes. The one fact all my medical students remember from the lecture I give them about Liverpool hospitals is that they were so short of beds in the second Royal Infirmary, they had to put 2 patients in each bed. And that invariably comes up. If they have to write a written question, they all remember that fact, surprisingly.
Sally, could I also point out that the fine wines you describe, I was a sommelier for the 20 Club, and I was a frequent visitor to all of these little Morrisons and Tesco's. Are you meant to be commercial on such a video? But so I think the fine wines has diminished somewhat.
Oh.
You were replaced. Sally, I don't want to interrupt this clubby atmosphere, but I need to move into tutorial mode here. There's 2 things I think you need to do with this work. One is to spend more time in Scotland, because I think there are some lacunae here and there from both the Glasgow and the Edinburgh colleges, one of which I have most to do with is it was founded about 13 years before the Royal College of Physicians, incidentally. But the second thing is I think you need to team up with a sociologist of class, because it's not just in the very interesting material you had about the exclusion of women from various aspects of medical social life as well as medical practice. In the early 19th and mid-19th century, I think much of what you said really did not reflect well either on the medical profession. And you'll put your colleague's map, of course, of the LMI membership. I'm fairly sure if you were to correlate that with either the price of property or some geographer's measure of socioeconomic status, you'd find a product moment correlation coefficient of about 9.5. This is who doctors were. Now, to go back to Rodney Street, of course, at the time the new infirmary, second infirmary was being built, in particular, and going on into the later 19th century, the vast majority of people in Liverpool of modest means, to say nothing of those who were really poor, got their medicine in 2 ways. One from the poor law medical officers, many of whom were highly qualified as surgeons and physicians, not just sort of poor surgeons who basically couldn't make it anywhere else. I'm thinking of people like Dr. Steele and others who worked in the north end of Liverpool. And secondly, from the 2 Liverpool dispensaries.
Yes.
The first of which was right up there, just off Scotland Road. There's one wall of it remains. And you look at the numbers of patients who were treated in those places. And doctors of a certain, how should we say, view of the common good, like Duncan, for example, our first medical officer and secretary of this institution, did their stint at the dispensaries. The second dispensary, of course, was the one at the bottom of Parliament Street, close to the southwest corner of the cathedral, a beautiful Georgian building that was utterly scandalously demolished for the building all that ersatz garbage in front between the cathedral and St George's Road.
You're digressing here, Paul.
Pardon?
You're digressing a little.
Yes, but as I said, that was the second of the 2 dispensaries. So there were many doctors who were not of this sort of Rodney Street class.
I totally agree with you,
And
yes.
I think, the thing needs to be widened from the sort of establishment medicine to the others.
I'd encourage you to read The Citadel, because I think that gives you a very accurate...
I'm very familiar with The Citadel, yes, which is actually being on Radio 4 at the moment as well. It's being broadcast.
So, thanks very much, Sally. I'm delighted the RCP are recording this and the video will be available, especially to members of the 20 and a nominal club who can watch it with equanimity. So, this has been great fun tonight. Thanks very much, Sally.
Thank you very much. Thank you.